All right.
All right, as everyone's filtering in, I'm just going to say a few notes of introduction and some housekeeping. So I'm Eric Goldwyn. I'm a professor here at NYU, and I run the Transportation Land Use Group at the Marron Institute, which is where we are located. And I'm really excited about today's talk. Nolan over here, as many of you know, has been a journalist in New York for over a decade, not just a decade, but over a decade. And some of the research that we do here sort of resonated with Nolan. Nolan wrote a lot about it. So Nolan and I have been talking for a long time. And then we have this opportunity to work together. And Nolan wants to talk about electrification, which is not something everyone wants to talk about, but it was music to my ears. I think it's a wonderful topic.
He gave me money.
I gave him some money. That is true. And as I don't say this to any of you, but when I talk to some people, I always say, there are one thing I could do if I were secretary, the US DOT, I would put a ton of money into electrification across this country so that we could have a passenger rail network that actually could compete with automobiles and short haul flights. I'm not Secretary of Transportation, and he's never asked me anything about anything. But it's a really important topic. Nolan has dug deep. Has mapped out lots of different scenarios. I think since we're here in the city of New York, we're going to talk a lot about New York related things, but some of these principles can be applied nationally, absolutely. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Nolan. I'm very excited. This is the first time we've ever done anything like this. Maybe we'll do more things like this. I don't know. But give it up for Nolan here.
We'll see how bad we're trying to far. Yeah, well, that was very kind. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the money. And I just want to start by also thanking Franklin, who's back in the corner, who's been invaluable throughout the entire process. Franklin is here at Marron and helps with a lot of the data crunching. We built an entire computer to do ridership modeling, and he's the guy who did it. So Franklin, thank you. And thank you all for coming on what is still a fairly early piece of the morning. This has been a product of the better part of a year. I'm pretty excited about it. I hope you guys are excited about it too, or at least excited enough to show up at 9 a.m. I'm going to make morning jokes all morning. And I just want to start with sort of like a very sort of fundamental principle that you'll sort of see throughout the entirety of this report, which is really in sum and substance that speed is really important. And we underestimate the importance of speed. And when we think about speed in terms of top speed. But we don't think about speed in terms of the average speed of delivery. So everything that you're going to see over the next, hopefully, hour, if I don't run long, which will be the first time in history, is going to sort of fit in this box, right? Which is that speed matters, that speed gives us capacity, that electrification is a great way to provide speed, and that speed is a tool to improve quality of life and to sort of knit the city into the surrounding regions and to sort of knit the various regions of the country together. This is something that the Brits discovered following the war when they embarked on their first big modernization. They focused first on the West Coast Main Line. It runs from London and connects to Manchester and then Liverpool and then up to Scotland. They electrified. They saw speeds increase by 25% plus in terms of the average speed. Trip duration falls by 25% plus. Ridership increases on a better than one-to-one basis. And we have a great control group, and that the rest of the British rail network at this time, in this, people are buying cars, freeways are getting built. So rail ridership outside of this falls by 8%. This is proof in the post-war era that speed can still get people onto trains. We see it again in the 1960s when we rescued the Northeast Corridor with what is bureaucratically named the NECIP, or the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, and the better known Metroliner, which was subsidized by the government. The Northeast Corridor had fallen into disrepair. 500,000 people over the course of a year were using the Northeast Corridor, which is sort of a mind-bogglingly small statistic. And fixing the Northeast Corridor, getting it up to 120 miles an hour, building high-level platforms so you can walk from the station onto the train and off, and using high-performance trains like the Metroliner managed to double ridership in the course of just 6 years. It made the Northeast Corridor relevant again and saved sort of the broad concept of fast passenger rail in the United States. We see it again here in New York with the LIRR and Metro North electrification extensions, which began in the 1970s and are wrapped up in the 1980s. And we see it again In California, with the electrification of the commuter line that runs between San Jose and San Francisco, ridership's up 75% year over year. They're delivering 25% more service with the same sized fleet, and their energy costs are down, despite delivering 25% more service. So this is an example of the sort of win-win-win that electrification can provide. You're cutting your fuel bill, which means you're cutting your operating costs. You've increased your ridership and thus transit revenues, and you've managed to squeeze a lot more productivity out of your existing fleet. And this is underpinned by a lot of research that comes out of Britain, beginning in the 1950s with the West Coast Main Line extension, and sort of continuing here into the 1970s, which shows that if you're managed to knock 1% off of a trip journey time, think about it in percentage. You have a journey that's 100 minutes long, you manage to get it to 90 minutes, you would see ridership increase by about 10%. We think about trip time as a thing you consider when you build a new transit system. We think about trip time as a thing that we can't deliver on the bus network reliably. But what we don't think about really outside of sort of the BRT conversation in the United States is this idea that you can take and speed up existing right-of-ways, and that speeding up existing right-of-ways obviously improves the capacity of the right-of-way, but two, generates new ridership and new revenue, allowing you to tie capital expenditure into future increases in revenue. And more importantly, it improves the quality of life across the region. You're giving people a piece of their day back. And because you're improving the ridership experience for sort of a built-in constituency, right? Like everyone who takes the train in every morning, you have a piece of the population that you can go and you can activate to campaign to fund these sorts of programs. I want to make your commute 15 minutes shorter each way. That is, at least in my mind, a fairly easy thing to sell, or at least easier to sell than a lot of the capital programs we try to sell now. So the benefits of electrification to us are fairly clear-cut. And so we set about trying to develop an infrastructure framework that allows us to deliver these gains and then to maximize these gains. And this is where we sort of focus in on where we lose time across the route. First, we lose time in terms of the traction we choose. Diesel is very slow. And then two, switching from diesel to electric locomotion can be further, you can compound those gains by switching to these high performance trains like the M8s that we see that run on the New Haven line, which are capable of getting from 0 to 80 miles an hour in about 60 seconds, which is 2 to 3 times faster than a diesel train. So if you think about it in terms of a route with 12 stops, if you're managing to get up to 80 miles an hour very quickly between 12 stops or not very quickly between 12 stops, you see how these gains sort of compound across the length of the route. Hello, microphone. Sort of the second piece of this is how we get onto trains and how we get off of trains. How we board trains beyond the MTA territory in this country is traditionally extraordinarily ineffective. The platforms are at ground level. The train's floor level is at give or take 48 inches. That means there's basically a 40-inch gap between the train and the platform. That means you have to have stairs. Using stairs becomes vastly more complicated if you have bags, if you have wheelchairs, if you have strollers. And so this bites particularly hard on the intercity services, where Amtrak will write schedules that in theory have 4-minute dwells, but in practice, they far exceed it. You saw the photo of Hudson. This is a photo from elsewhere in the system. And so this is why, as part of the NEC IP project, they installed high-level platforms. And then the MTA takes this one step further in the 1960s when they designed the Metropolitan train cars, which are the design we still use broadly speaking today, and adopted really wide doors. So this means that no matter what you're carrying, no matter what you're pushing or pulling, you can easily walk on and off the train. So at Jamaica, which has extraordinarily complicated ingress and egress patterns, the dwells are a minute. You've got people going to the beach, so they got bags. You got people going to the airport, so they got bags. You have everyone needing to change trains to go to another branch, and they can do it in a minute. Whereas a stop like Hudson, which has a few dozen people getting on and off, we're talking about dwells that can last for 5 or 10 minutes. And then you take this and you replicate it across the entire system. And you see how these gains compound. So we're delivering speed through electrification, and we're delivering speed through efficient design. That's the whole premise of this. And we're borrowing heavily from history. That's Bill Ronan and Nelson Rockefeller. And they're the guys who came up with a lot of this stuff. And so we're taking their idea and we're modernizing their idea. And the big modernization is we're switching power systems to what has become the global standard over the last 70 years, using overhead catenary. We'll start with the speed advantages. Overhead catenary means you can run trains as fast as your right-of-way can support, whereas both diesel and third rail are heavily constrained just by the physics of both sources of power. not only does it allow you to run a lot faster, it costs a lot less. So these are the last, one is the proposed Port Jefferson project. The last is the last big MTA third rail electrification out to Ronkonkoma. And you can see that in the best case, the third rail project, and this was 40 years ago, adjusted for inflation, cost about $50 million a mile, which means that third rail, in the best case we could find, costs more to extend than overhead electrification does in the worst case, which was Caltrain, which we believe to be the most expensive overhead electrification project ever in history, period. It was an extraordinarily complicated project. It got tied up in the courts for years. There were pandemic delays, a whole host of things. Basically, everything that could go wrong with this project did go wrong with this project. And despite it being sort of like the water world of no Kevin Costner fans, fantastic. But despite basically being the water world of like, you know, of electrification, it still comes in at something like 15 to 20% cheaper than the cheapest third rail electrification. And there's two other points to this. One of which is we have sort of what we call our first wave projects, which are places that haven't done electrification in a long time or haven't done electrification before, commissioning systems, and they don't have a ton of experience sort of scoping it. So you get a fairly high first band of costs, but these costs are driven lower with experience. So you see it between the two big Midlands electrifications, and you see it here in the United States. If you go back to history, New Jersey Transit spent, adjusted for inflation, close to $20 million a mile to electrify the North Coast line. And then Amtrak, borrowing from a lot of that for its North End electrification, which extends from New Haven to Boston, managed to get that down to about $11 million a mile. So not only are the third rail costs automatically lower, basically just from the sheer design of the infrastructure, they can be driven substantially, and I hopefully sufficiently lower, as you get more experience doing it, right? So there is money in the banana stand to be had. This doesn't mean that you have to get rid of your legacy third rail networks. We have a rail line already that ties together overhead electrification and third rail coming into the city. It's Metro North's most ridden line. It's the New Haven line. And you have trains that run on the overhead to about Pelham. They switch over to the third rail, and then they come the rest of the way into Grand Central. The New Haven and Hartford Railroad ran into a lot of the same cost issues when they were trying to extend overhead wiring over electrification, and they opted for overhead wiring 100 years ago. Because even in the 1920s, the economics of electrifying with overhead catenary were superior, particularly over long distances, to electrifying with third rail. And the Pennsylvania Railroad borrows this design to do their electrification from New York City to Washington, D.C. in the 1930s. The Brits have used a similar setup. They have what they call the Thames Link. South of London, the rail network is predominantly third rail. North of London, it's predominantly overhead because they were electrified at different points. And they needed a train to be able to tie it together. This is the train. It's one of the busiest railways in London. So there are not just examples here where we had to sort of, again, find a way to make it work. The Brits have run into the same situation and come up with roughly the same solution. And it allows you to take all of the advantages of catenary and apply them to new electrifications while keeping the legacy network. And then there's the operating costs, which some people in this room care about immensely, and they should. Catenary loses a lot less electricity and transmission, so you cut your electric bill by 15%. It also makes track maintenance simpler, which means that you can reduce the amount of labor hours you need to do track maintenance by as much as 20%. So we take all this together and we apply it just sort of at the highest level to the MTA network. These aren't electrification costs. These are full-blown network modernization costs. So this is double tracking everywhere. This is replacement of the structures. This is upgrading the stations. And to do it with third rail, you're talking about a bill of between $21 to $25 billion to extend double tracking, electrification, and full modernization across the entirety of the diesel territory for both the Metro North and the LIRR. Switching to overhead cuts that bill by between $6 to $9 billion. We keep every other component. We've just swapped the power systems. And that's a massive camera, Evan. We just swapped the power systems out. And simply swapping the power systems takes electrification from being the single biggest cost component of a modernization project to making it just a cost component, right? So modernization, broadly speaking, without electrification costs about $60 million a mile. Third rail costs about $60 million a mile. Right there, you're baked in at $120 million a mile to do electrification. Just switching power supplies takes that $120 million a mile and shrinks it down to about $80 million a mile. So right there is a third back in your cost. So beyond the MTA network, what does this mean for inner city services? As part of getting the money from Eric, I had to agree to not obsessively focus on the New York region. So we're going to pick on a couple of other cities real fast. But broadly speaking, we think this infrastructure design framework allows us to take the inner city services that we have, allows us to take the commuter rail services that we have, and one, create enough capacity on these systems to support simultaneous inner city and commuter service, like we do with the Northeast Corridor. And two, allow us to dramatically accelerate trips across the country, shrinking the sort of the geography of the country in process. So we're going to start with the commuter rail example. This is Boston to Providence, which is part of the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak electrified it as part of the North End extension back in the 90s. The MBTA still runs diesel for a whole lot of reasons. But this is a very slow setup. So you have diesel locomotion, you have low-level platforms, which means you need stairs to get up and down. And what this means is our baseline for performance is it takes about 75 minutes to get from Providence to Boston on the train. And it takes about 80 minutes to drive it, assuming a little bit of traffic, because this is going into Boston. Just fixing the infrastructure without even touching the speeds, and this train tops out at 75 miles an hour, means you get 25 minutes back just by fixing the amount of time you spend in the stations and just by fixing the amount of time that you spend getting up and then slowing down from 75 miles an hour. That, again, without touching the speeds, makes the train now 30 minutes faster than driving, flipping the value proposition on its head. We see the same thing applying into the inner city network. Most of the route between Chicago and Detroit is publicly owned, with the exception of the pieces through Chicago. This, again, is diesel locomotion. It's, again, low-level platforms. Again, you need stairs for lighting, and on top of it, there are fairly major congestion issues in Chicago. You fix the congestion issues in Chicago by putting more tracks in, which Amtrak has planned to do. The right-of-way was originally built by the old New York Central for 4 tracks. Now it is 2. They go back to 4, solving the congestion problem. It's expensive, but it's not hugely expensive. So that gets you an hour back, taking the train from being the slowest option by an hour to roughly even with driving, which maybe does the trick. But you can really compound those gains by fixing the stations, upgrading it to high-level platforms, and applying electrification. And again, without even touching top speeds, you're now 40 minutes faster than driving. And you're basically even with flying once you start counting the time it takes to get to O'Hare and then the time it takes to get to downtown Detroit from Detroit Metro. And this right-of-way is good for higher speeds, too. So this is sort of a baseline to build upon. We assume no improvement in the running speed at 210 minutes, which is 3.5 hours. And we just take the dead time, the amount of time spent getting up to speed, the amount of time spent at stations. We call it the stop penalty or the dead time along the route. And we're shrinking it just with better infrastructure design from 70 minutes to about 20 minutes. And then once you have the electrification in place, you can look at everywhere where you're going 90 or 100 miles an hour with the diesel, so the right-of-way is really straight, and electrification allows you to crank that up to 125 or 150, and then the runtime starts to shrink too. We assume none of those improvements, and already we're faster than driving by 40 minutes, and even with flying. Basically, our current right-of-ways across the country, and this is sort of proof of the concept, are capable of supporting service at speeds that are comparable with the Northeast Corridor that we already have. And the Northeast Corridor has been able to claim the bulk of the trip share between New York and DC and between New York and Boston at these speeds. This is doable without having to go the whole way in and build an entirely new high-speed rail line like they're trying to do in California. So this is a lower risk way to get a whole lot of trips back on trains. And then there's the New York case study. The Hudson Line and the Empire Service, which overlap. Metro North has the electric service up to Croton. Then there's fairly frequent diesel service to Poughkeepsie, and Amtrak is sort of the overlapping pattern to Albany and then out west to Buffalo. It's one of the most heavily ridden inner city routes across the country. It's also a fairly busy route for Metro North. And not only is it, fairly well ridden, it's fairly famous, which means we get great pictures of Cary Grant and Eve Marie Saint. But it also means that there's a lot of research that we can lean into. In 1994, NYSERDA, separate from NYSDOT, separate from sort of everybody else, does a study as part of a maglev experiment that attempted to establish the baseline of what the existing corridor was capable of. They built a computer model, they plugged a non-tilt TGV into the computer model, and they just ran the model to see how fast they could go just in terms of a computer simulation. And lots of people, not lots of people, everyone sort of thinks of the Hudson Line as being a fairly slow corridor until you get up to Poughkeepsie. And then once you get above Poughkeepsie, it's still next to a river. And so it's curvy. And so you can't go fast. That's not right. So in the computer modeling, they managed to get the New York Penn to Tarrytown piece of the line up to 110 miles an hour, which is far faster than we run today and not slow by any stretch of the imagination. The average speed is 63 miles an hour. So again, they're getting up and keeping up at speed fairly consistently. It's not far off the speeds we deliver on the Northeast Corridor. Tarrytown to Poughkeepsie, they can get it up to 122 miles an hour. Again, not a stretch of track that anyone thinks is terribly fast. Between Poughkeepsie and Albany, they got it up to 143 miles an hour. And then even more impressively, for a right-of-way that was designed by the Vanderbilts, or people hired by the Vanderbilts just got the money, 150 years ago, the speeds on the western portion of this route are really, truly impressive. So Albany to Schenectady is 165 miles an hour, which is faster than any top speed achieved in the Northeast Corridor today. You managed to basically keep those speeds up the whole way to Syracuse, and then beyond Syracuse to Buffalo. Again, not a piece of routing that anyone thinks is terribly fast, but that's because of how we use it today. The computer modeling shows the train, again, a non-tilt train is capable of getting up to 170 miles an hour between Syracuse and Rochester, and then up to 200 miles an hour between Rochester and Buffalo. This is a right-of-way that is 150 years old, and in the computer modeling is capable of speeds that meet or exceed anything the French have built in terms of modern railroading, which is really impressive, but it's not how we use it. So why? Oh, and then more to the point, we have real-life examples of actually going this fast. So the turboliners never worked right, but in the testing of the turboliners, they managed to get the piece of trackage between Hudson and Albany up to 125 miles an hour, which is faster than we go today. So the right-of-way is really capable. We just have to unlock the capabilities of the right-of-way. And so we have to start by asking why we go slow. And we go slow because of how we power the right-of-way, not because of the right-of-way's geometry. And that's just sort of like base finding number one. The third rail power network that the MTA inherited from the New York Central is weak. It struggles to get the M7s up to speed. So that's the constraint below Croton. And then above Croton, you have the really poor diesel acceleration. And you can see the difference here. The Silverliner that SEPTA uses is not a terribly fancy train, but it is a capable train, and it's capable of getting to 80 miles an hour, again, in about 60 seconds. A diesel takes 3 minutes. And so when you have station spacings of 4 or 5 miles apart, you think of Cortland to Peekskill to Beacon up to Poughkeepsie, these are fairly tight station spacings. Diesels are a really poor choice for that because you're having to slow down and speed up a lot. And then on top of that, if you're trying to overlap that with a commuter rail service, you have something that's slowing down and speeding up a lot in front of an intercity train, and it slows the whole thing down, which is why the train to Albany in the evening takes 20 minutes longer than the train to Albany in the morning. So these are the past studies, 4 of them. There are a lot more. The speed gains are identified in the 1994 NYSERDA study, which you see all the way on one side. And then the most recent study is all the way on the other side, the high-speed rail study. The high-speed rail study incorporates very few of these speed advantages. And it does so because there's no consensus among the agencies and the operators on the corridor to do electrification. And this gets into sort of how we think about railroading in this country post the breakup of the Pennsylvania Railroad and post the breakup of the New York Central, and sort of this odd bifurcation between passenger service and freight service, which we'll get to in a second. But basically, this corridor is capable of a lot. We should know that it's capable of a lot, but we don't even incorporate the capabilities of the corridor into our planning to ask what is even possible. So this is our baseline. Our baseline is sort of this idea that we can take the Hudson Line and think of the Hudson Line as sort of the next Northeast Corridor, as the backbone of a statewide rapid electric rail network that really shrinks and compresses the geography across the state. Albany in 2 hours or less, Syracuse in under 4 hours, Buffalo in under 6 hours. All of a sudden, the train becomes the fastest and the highest capacity way to get between each of New York's major cities all the way into New York City, despite the relative geographic disadvantage of the right-of-way. You've got to go all the way up to Albany, and then you basically hang a left and then keep going to Buffalo. So the application of it to the commuter rail pieces, we're talking about the local train getting into Beacon into 75 minutes. We're talking about literally every train to Poughkeepsie being faster than 90 minutes. This is enough, we think, to generate an extra 500,000 trips a year on this right of way, just the commuter rail piece of this right of way. And sub 90-minute trips between New York City and Poughkeepsie, and then faster all the way down the line, really allows us to start to rethink the Hudson Valley, the Hudson Valley's economy, and allows us to inject new life into parts of the state that have really struggled in sort of the post-industrial era. Peekskill, post the General Motors plant. Poughkeepsie, which is something like 30 or 40% off of the population that it had in 1950. We start tying the whole state together, and we start to unlock all kinds of potential. You can commute in a way that you never could before. New York City businesses can have offices in the Hudson Valley in a way that they never had before. A whole world sort of opens up. And these opportunities extend even further north when you start thinking about Albany and Schenectady, where trip times to Albany of 2 hours and 5 minutes. Poughkeepsie on the express pattern is now 75 minutes. Rhine Cliff is now closer to the city than Beacon is. Hudson is now closer to the city than Poughkeepsie currently is. And all of this builds on all of the money that the state is spending to try to revive Albany and the Albany downtown, and to turn both Albany and Syracuse into chip manufacturing hubs. And there's more time that can be had out of this route too by addressing the power system between Riverdale and Croton, but that's a topic for another day. So how much would it cost to make every trip between New York City and Poughkeepsie less than 90 minutes? The answer is $1.5 billion. So that's 23 minutes back for $1.5 billion spent, not assuming any federal match, which is tremendous value for money when you think about the previous investments that we've made in the rail network here in the state and previous investments made by other passenger rail services across the country. Extending it to Albany would be another $2 billion. Extending it up to Saratoga, because you'd probably have to reconstruct the entire right-of-way, would be about $3 billion. And this includes the cost of reconstructing the entire right-of-way. And again, the right-of-way work is far more expensive than the electrification, provided you use the catenary. And we're talking about, if you're thinking about it in terms of Albany, if you work for the state and you need to go up to Albany, you can do it in a day instead of having to spend the night. If you're going to Saratoga because you want to go see the races, all of a sudden this becomes a day trip, and you start to really, again, change and integrate the state in a way that it hasn't been before. And you start to really allow the rest of the state to tap into the economic engine of New York City. So this is, broadly speaking, our idea. We package it. All the packages build towards a goal. And the goal is 2 Northeast Corridor caliber rail networks that span all the way from the east at Montauk and Greenport, all the way to the west at Buffalo. That a train is possible for basically every journey you could imagine in New York State along these 2 corridors. But we do it through a series of standalone packages. So you electrify to Poughkeepsie, and everyone between Croton and Poughkeepsie benefits. People going north of Poughkeepsie benefit too, because you've reduced the congestion by speeding up the corridor. But you could stop at Poughkeepsie and you haven't left a giant hole in the ground. There are benefits to be had. The economy there can grow, commutes are shorter. And then if you want to keep going, you can keep going, right? This is not an all-in proposition. So this reduces the risk, and it allows each package to deliver really noticeable improvements along the line, building support, or to borrow for, sort of the James Bondianism, where either the, our hero or the villain have to say the name of the movie in the title, momentum for transportation. So that's the idea. And we extend it westward. New York to Syracuse in 3 hours and 40 minutes makes it easier to get to Syracuse than it is to get to Washington, D.C., makes it quicker to get to Syracuse than it is to get to Boston. We deliver using the existing right-of-way that benefits directly to the downtowns of Amsterdam and Utica and Rome, places that have been hard hit by deindustrialization. We extended even further west to Rochester. Those trips shrink to under 5 hours. So now getting between New York City and Rochester, rail is the way to go. Ditto Buffalo. It is, as it's a 90-minute flight to Buffalo. You assume it takes 90 minutes to get to LaGuardia, to get through security at LaGuardia, and then you land in Buffalo and you got to get into the city. Anyways, this is trip time competitive with flying, despite it being something close to 450 miles. And it makes it vastly easier to go. It dramatically expands the capacity between these cities. And it allows us to start thinking about, weekend trips to Buffalo in a way that you haven't before. If you want to go see a football team capable of winning games, you can go up on a Saturday and come back on a Sunday afternoon. So it's a complicated project, no doubt. The line, particularly between Amsterdam and Buffalo, is quite busy with freight. There are 40 to 60 trains a day And our idea to fix that is basically to take the Chicago idea, and it's also recommended as a potential alternative in the NYSERDA study, to just put the tracks back. It used to be 4 tracks. It's now 2 tracks. We can put the 4 tracks back. When the New York Central designed this thing 150 years ago, they had de facto segregation between freight and passenger service because their freight trains were slower and their passenger trains were faster, which is the same issue we run into today. They fixed it by putting the freight on the north, which are the tracks that were removed. We put the tracks back. They automatically feed the freight yards. CSX can do whatever it wants. And then you upgrade the southern tracks to be able to tap into a lot of the speed potential. And it's there. The space is there. It's sitting unused. You have to find a way to sell it to CSX, and you sell it to CSX because they get segregation that they want, and they get more capacity by getting by getting the current Amtrak service off their lines. It's expensive. It would be $13.5 billion to stretch it from Schenectady to Syracuse. It would be another $14.5 billion to sort of stretch it to Buffalo. But we're talking about, 1, binding the state together, 2, massively expanding the amount of transportation capacity there is between downstate and upstate, and between upstate and Western New York, in a way that hasn't happened since the Thruway. And I think it's pretty easy to think about what it would cost to build the Thruway today. And there's sort of another comparison I want to throw in here, which is we've spent a lot of money rebuilding LaGuardia, making it a place that we don't hate. And we're spending a lot of money rebuilding JFK to make it a place that we don't hate. The LaGuardia reconstruction adjusted for inflation is about $10 to $11 billion. JFK is $16 billion and counting in current money. And so for roughly $30 billion, we're rebuilding 2 metropolitan airports. And for roughly $30 billion, we can tie the entire state together with a rapid high-speed electric rail network that not only sort of reshapes how we get around the state, but also allows us to really free up a bunch of capacity at the airports by moving some of those flights between Buffalo and New York City to the train. And then Delta can take those slots and use those slots for something like more flights to London or more flights to Paris. And so you have a world in which high-speed rail not only, or just rapid rail in general, is, using existing right-of-ways, not only binds the state together, but allows us to grow our connections to the rest of the planet. So this is, broadly speaking, the idea, making rail the way to go for basically any trip you can imagine under 300 miles. This is what it would look like potentially for the Northeast. We pull Raleigh into the Northeast corridor functionally. You think about what it would mean for a town like Bethlehem or a town like Reading being able to be tied with a rapid service into Philadelphia. We just walk you through what it would mean for New York, ditto Connecticut and Massachusetts and Maine. And then the same applies for the Midwest. We looked at places where there's a lot of excess rail infrastructure. 2 regions that support this the most easily are the Northeast and the Midwest. And you can sort of think about what it would mean to have a train capable of going from, Chicago to Milwaukee in 70 or 80 minutes, as opposed to the current 2 hours. Or think about getting Detroit again from 5.5 to 6 hours down to under 4 hours. And then you can sort of grow it to Grand Rapids, to St. Louis, to Madison, and then from Detroit to Toledo. And perhaps one of my favorite little facts about this is the line from Toledo to Detroit actually comes in at Ann Arbor. So you could have, in theory, like a train to the game that is Ohio State to the University of Michigan back and forth. And you can make Midwest football country like train to the game territory, like we do with the Yankees and the Mets. So we think the potential here is enormous. And so you're probably wondering, why aren't we doing this? We asked the same question. You're probably looking at me thinking, this guy worked for the Post. He can't possibly be this smart, and you're correct. And so, because I was one of the dumber guys at the Post. So there are a lot of reasons for the stall out. But the core reason we've stalled out is because we keep learning this and we keep forgetting this. So a lot of this research was done in the 1920s and the 1930s by the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New Haven and the Hartford and the New York Central. And then they enter a period of sustained decline, beginning with the Depression. Then there's the Second World War, and then you have the explosion of the automotive age and the construction of the freeways in the 1950s. They basically zero out their R&D to the point where the feds take it over in the 1960s. And redo a lot of this work. If you go back and if you read the work that's done in the 1960s and the 1970s, there is a through line of commentary about how much we've forgotten about engineering trains and engineering right-of-ways because of the total disinvestment for about 30 years by the private railroads. And we basically spend the 1970s recreating this body of knowledge. And then in our infinite wisdom, we laid off everyone who recreated this body of knowledge in the 1970s. In the early 1980s, the staffing of the Federal Railroad Administration is cut by 2/3. The research budget of the Federal Transit Administration, which was then UMTA, was cut by something on the order of 90%. The people who survived the layoffs at the FTA were given honorary pink slips as a joke by the political appointees from the administration at the time, which did wonders for morale. And so this work was lost. There's stuff we can't find today. It's just been totally lost, or it was shelved and forgotten. And I want to take a moment here just to sort of say thank you to the folks at the FTA and the FRA who'll pull some of this stuff for us out of the warehouses, scan it, and we've been able to put it back in the public domain. One big example of this is a lot of the electrification work that was done on the Northeast Corridor in the 1970s, some of which was never built, but a lot of which is on the shelf again. And actually, if it had been built, would have prevented a lot of the problems that Amtrak's having on through New Jersey today. So the Hudson line then, and really, I guess the Northeast Corridor is an example of how the cuts hurt, how the knowledge base is splintered or lost. We have no single entity in charge of vision or coordinating upgrades. And this leads to widespread myths about what the lines are capable of. It's too curvy. It's a pretty frequent one, or it's too congested, or it's too old. And this means we have to go build something new, or we have to go do something with experimental technology. An example of this is the maglev report. We spent a lot of money on a maglev report, and shockingly to no one, maglev went nowhere. It hasn't gone anywhere across the planet. But functionally what it does is it puts the people who should be pushing agencies to do improvements, to ask for things that can't be done. The agencies can't do them. And so we end up in a cul-de-sac, if you will, right? Sort of a loop, a feedback loop of no one knows what riders value. The freights have the expertise, but they have a very different sort of set of priorities. When you defund the public sector, all the expertise goes to the private sector. The private sector, in this case, are freight railroads. And then so where the expertise lies is sort of what gets built. So the freight bias for big structures, that way they can run unscheduled operations, bleeds over into passenger planning. You see it, like we know we can't go faster, we need a fifth track, or we can't go faster, we need another yard, or we can't see it, ... And the resulting projects are very expensive because they involve structural works, but they don't deliver stuff that writers can intuitively appreciate. So, putting in more trackage might reduce schedule conflicts, but one, writers assume you're writing a schedule you can run anyways. And two, reducing scheduling conflicts doesn't actually speed up service. So, you sort of run into this world where we're building stuff that's very expensive. People don't see the benefits. And this makes it harder to go get more money to keep building the things that we need. And so we just would sort of want to start here, which is, there are all these sort of myths and preconceptions about where electrification can go and where it can fit and where it can't, and ditto the high-level platforms. And this is part of the brain drain. So, one, can what we do work on our existing routes? In giant photo fashion, the answer is yes. So myth number one is you can't run container trains under wires. That's wrong. They were designed to run under wires because the designs for how we do freight trains date back to when freight was on the Northeast Corridor, which was electrified, back to when the Northeast Corridor was not only one of the busiest passenger railways in the country, but was a key artery. So when the Pennsylvania Railroad, which did a lot of this work, and the New York Central did a lot of this work, and their successor at Conrail did a lot of this work, everything they designed has to fit under wires, right? Like, this is not optional because freight doesn't exit the Northeast Corridor until they build the bypass in the 1980s. Ditto high-level platforms. CSX runs freight, standard-sized freight trains, past high-level platforms on the Hudson Line all the time. And yet, talking to folks, you get all kinds of, it can't fit, you're going to bump, et cetera, whatever. It's not true. So not only can you fit these improvements on lines that have freight traffic on them, the coming mergers really open the door for us to think about places where we can put passenger service that we haven't been able to put passenger service before, and to bring freights to the table in a way to say, we want to put these improvements in, We want to know what you want from us in order to put these improvements in, because we know these improvements fit. They're going to be encumbering a lot of debt to buy each other out in typical Wall Street fashion. So they're going to be looking to dispense with assets to pay down that debt. Mergers have to be approved regulatorily. They have to be in the public interest. We can, whether you're a transit agency or Department of State Transportation, there are two processes. There's the federal antitrust process, and there's a separate railroad regulatory process where there's going to be an open record, where agencies are going to have the opportunity to go and say, we really want to put these improvements in, and we think we need the access to be able to do this on these pre-selected lines in order for these mergers to be in the public interest. We have a carrot and we have a stick, and the public sector should not be afraid to try to use this opportunity to go and deliver much better, much needed passenger service on these lines, which the freights are using 2 or 3 times a day and effectively squatting on. So momentum is a framework, but we also think of it as a standards manual. If you've ever been to the MoMA and you've seen the giant book that New York City Transit put together, which became sort of the guidepost for how we sign transit across the country, we hope that this can sort of do basically the same thing. One, that there's a framework. That two, by sort of laying out the framework, we can give folks an idea of what they should be asking for, how they should be speccing their project, and how they should be scoping their projects. And by controlling spec and scope at the front end, the game is to reduce cost and to reduce risk. And then by empowering the agencies with the knowledge of what they need in these projects, that they can sit down at the table and have a much more evil level, 8, 9 in the morning, leveled negotiation with the freights for the necessary access to do this. So we apply this, we've applied this to the Metro North Territory with sort of a sample line, and we're going to apply it now to the Long Island Railroad, which is the busiest commuter railroad in the country. One that expanded electrification in the 70s and the 80s, but hasn't really done it since. The Long Island Railroad's planning doctrine, dating back to the 1980s, we sort of came to name it sort of the mainline strategy. It's predicated on a bunch of ideas, overlapping assumptions. One, that electrification is extremely expensive, and so the benefits have to be concentrated along a central corridor. 2, that car access on Long Island is universal. 3, that folks are willing to drive to access high-quality electric service. And then 4, to get back to the central idea that Long Island's population is sort of equally distributed across the axes of north, mid, and south. So by developing the literal central corridor, you, in theory, make access at least not more terrible for any one part of the island. Everyone has equal access to it, even if they have to drive. This is codified in '94 with the strategic review. And this strategic review basically comes to lay out what would be the next 20 years of capital spend at the Long Island Railroad. We're going to focus on the east of Jamaica part of it, but west of Jamaica, you can see what would become East Side Access. But the list of projects is going to be familiar to everyone in the room. The Ronkonkoma double track, the 3rd track main line to Hicksville. The only pieces of this program that don't get built are the electrifications to Port Jefferson and to Yaphank. And then this program, again, focuses all of its investments on what we would call the mainline corridor. So there's very little money set out for improvements on the South Shore, or for the off mainline branches, or for the diesel services. So we start by looking at what the Long Island Railroad is and how riders are using it. Riders use the main line, but they use the South Shore branches just as much. And we sort of grouped it together to sort of think of it as a main line and then a South Shore main line, 2 main lines effectively. And they generate an equal number of trips, which we found to be quite surprising, because if you look at how the capital has been spent over the last 20 years, you wouldn't expect it. And if you think about how people think of the railroad in sort of the popular conception, that's not how people think of the railroad. You think of it as main line to Hicksville and then split out, and the South Shore is just something that we inherited. The South Shore is a huge generator of trips. And if you look at how the populations are laid out across Long Island, this makes a lot of sense. So the teal are stations on the South Shore. The orange, tangerine-ish, depending on the screen you're looking at, or dark red for some reason over here, are the off mainline branches. And then we paired it by how many people live around each station. So it's a population density analysis. Where are the populations densest on Long Island, and how does that correlate to the railroad system that we have in terms of the infrastructure that we've inherited? And the mainline strategy has basically focused the bulk of the capital spend east of Jamaica on a fraction of the population. So if you think about transit-oriented development, if you think about putting density near transit, we've been spending lots of money on railroad, but we haven't been spending that money on the places where the people actually are. So 22 of the 45 top station densities are along the South Shore. They're along the Long Beach, they're along the Far Rockaway, they're along the Babylon branch, or actually the West Hempstead too. And then you look at sort of what we call the off mainline branches, which predominantly the Hempstead branch, and then surprisingly to us, the Oyster Bay branch. There are tremendous population densities that lie along both lines, but you wouldn't know it from the capital investment or from the schedules. The assumption is everyone will drive to the main line. And so we took these findings and we just sort of asked ourselves, is there more that can be gotten out of the mainline strategy? When you think we think it's reached a point of diminishing returns. South Shore ridership remains on par despite slower speeds, despite more stops, despite much less capital investment. And it doesn't correlate with the population densities. The population densities correlate with the ridership of the railroad. So this indicates to us that there's a strong rider preference in the ticketing data for people to take the service from their closest station. That's naturally what they want to do. And that making people drive to get high quality transit induces a tremendous amount of friction in terms of accessing railroad service. It also exacerbates the parking shortages along the main line. The MTA has had to pay for a lot of parking garages along mainline stations, particularly on the inner portions of the main line. And it also puts a lot of cars on the road that otherwise wouldn't be there. And Long Island has a traffic crisis. So we took all these things and evaluated the branches, starting with ridership. This is borrowing the British literature in terms of associating trip time savings with ridership induction. The Port Jefferson would be the most ridden of the branches, and so we'll start there. But again, what surprised us and what follows the population density data is that the Inner Montauk appears to be a fairly strong candidate for improvement. Oyster Bay, surprisingly, appears to be a fairly strong candidate for improvement. And then the Outer Montauk appears to be a fairly strong candidate for improvement. And of note for the Outer Montauk, we'll talk about this more in a second, all the population density data that we have predates the pandemic because there hasn't been a census since. And it's fairly commonly well known that there are a lot of folks who are now living full-time out along the Montauk branch who weren't there before the pandemic and are occasionally taking trips in the city. You see sort of the two halves of the mainline extension sort of down there at the bottom, which also caught us by surprise. So what we had was sort of a two-pronged test, one of which was we tried to sanity test what the model loved, and then we tried to sanity test what the model didn't like because, again, I'm not smart. Someone had a good thought. What was that good thought? Population densities, you can see them along the North Shore, you can see them along the South Shore, and then you can sort of see here, this is Ronkonkoma, and this would be Medford, this would be Old Yaphank, and this would be New Yaphank. But the population densities really start to fall off sort of as you get further to the east when you get away from the coast towards the center. So the model loves Port Jefferson. Folks who live on the Port Jefferson have been campaigning for electrification for a very long time. Going back to the 1960s, it was promised repeatedly. And we think it makes a lot of sense. And we think that switching to overhead power makes it a project that can be built within the current capital resource envelope that the MTA has. So the current project is expected to cost $3.1 billion looking at the 20-year needs assessment. It includes a whole host of improvements, including a structural reworking to support double tracking, installing double tracking, and the rest of the 9 yards, a new yard. A new yard out at Port Jefferson. And as you can see from the chart, we keep all the structural improvements. We keep the new yard, but simply by swapping to a more efficient power system, a power system that costs less to build, we managed to knock $800 million off the price tag. There's a lot of, and to us, that's really good value for money. There's a lot of, if you go to any sort of railroad, how we ran the railroad yesterday is how we run the railroad today is how we run the railroad tomorrow, because that's how you make sure you don't break the railroad. They are naturally cautious and conservative by nature, and rightly so. A railroad is not an app. But we think that these sorts of savings make sense to start thinking about adopting the New Haven line strategy to extend electrification. The benefits are immense. We're talking about knocking 20 minutes off a trip. We're talking about relieving the congestion along the main line corridor, particularly in terms of parking and in traffic. We're talking about expanding the access between the city and Stony Brook University and between the airport and Stony Brook University, helping to turn Stony Brook into a tier 1 university, which has been a gubernatorial objective for a great many administrations. We build all that, right? And simply by changing how we power the line, we knock $800 million off the case. And we think it warrants full exploration to see, what it entails. The second piece, so we love the Port Jefferson line, and then we sort of pursue in the next sort of series of orders what the model told us we should look at. We're going to start with the Oyster Bay because it had the biggest increase in ridership, and it's fairly short, and the history is fairly remarkable. Plus, I get to pick a picture of Teddy Roosevelt waiting for a train in here. But the Oyster Bay branch is about 15 miles long, and it has 13 stops in it. So the poor characteristics of diesel mean that the service is really slow. It also means that the benefits of electrification on a line like this, again, where you have spacings that are not far off what you would find in portions of the New York City subway system, are immense. So you have a lot of density to potentially get trips from. 7 of the 13 stops are among the densest stops in the Long Island Railroad network. And you have a long history of people pushing for it. There was a big push for it in the 1920s. It was one of the first lines to be promised to be electrified at the end of the war by the Pennsylvania Railroad, but the Pennsylvania Railroad's finances fell apart. When Program for Action was initially outlined, when the state took over the LIRR in 1963, Oyster Bay was once again promised, and each time it sort of hit the cutting room floor. The history's right. Electrifying this line would be hugely advantageous to the ridership on this line. And we think this is one example where sort of the mainline focus has sort of been to the detriment of the Long Island Railroad. We're talking about cutting trip times by 25%. An 80-minute trip in from Oyster Bay becomes less than an hour. There's substantial density, as we just pointed out, along the stations. And maybe the way to help sell this idea is to think of it not so much as an Oyster Bay project, but to think of it as a mainline capacity project, right? So if we're moving demand off of the main line and we're putting it on a branch feeding the main line, we have alleviated the crowding and a lot of the conditions that have led us to spend all this money on the main line in the first place. We're just moving the demand back to where the demand is originating. So that's the Oyster Bay case. But for the sort of the Football Night in America showdown, we really wanted to sort of zero in on this debate between the South Shore and the main line. And this debate is predicated by that 1994 study. So the 1994 study advocates for the electrification to Yaphank over the extension of electrification on the South Shore. It's a duality that has been set up by the railroad itself. And as you can see from the population density, this is a cut of the eastern portion of the island. There's a lot of population density along the Montauk. A lot of the population density along the Montauk is actually south of the Montauk. In a lot of ways, the Montauk branch is the central line for the eastern portion of Long Island. And if you sort of sketch it as a schematic, each one of these circles is relative population around each station. And you can see that despite having inferior service, diesel service, slow service, a shuttle that requires a change at either Babylon or Jamaica, the population densities along the South Shore are not only equivalent to the main line on the inner portion, they exceed the main line on the outer portion, and there are far more densities from which to draw from. So there's a giant gap, for instance, between Riverhead and Yaphank, and then another gap between Yaphank and Medford, and then another gap between Medford and Ronkonkoma, where there are solid population densities at Sayville and Patchogue and East Patchogue, and then Bellport, and then Mastic Shirley, and so forth. So in terms of where you would naturally expect, if you were planning a transit line today, to find the ridership, you would expect it naturally to come more so from the Montauk piece of it than from an extension of the main line beyond Ronkonkoma. And then we asked, where is the existing demand? Can the capacity that currently exists on both lines meet the needs of both lines? And the answer is no on the Montauk, and it's been that way for a long time, particularly in the summer season. That's 2015 and 2019 and 2024. We think that they probably that the LIRR needs the ability to put 20,000 seats in the peak direction on a peak day, which is 20 trains, give or take. And the schedules into Montauk are less than half of that. And that's across the entirety of the line. So the line sort of bifurcated, but we'll do that in the Q&A. At most, they can deliver 16,000 seats. Only 8,000 of those seats can get all the way to Montauk. 8,000 of the seats basically stop at Patchogue. And there's evidence of the demand everywhere. Not only are the trains packed, the Hamptons Jitney is running 30 buses a day between New York City and the East End, which at 100 people per bus is roughly 3,000 people right there, which is another 3 trains on top of whatever the existing schedule is. So the summertime crunch has become more of a year-round thing. You literally couldn't fit any more people on the trains in July. July ridership is flat. But for the other 11 months of the year, ridership is up by more than a quarter. And again, this is 2023 data. 2024 data has grown more, but we didn't get it until I would have to redo the slides. And again, and we just didn't have the time to do it. So this is up even more. And the other piece of this is that all this ridership growth is coming at the portions of the line where it's the hardest to deliver the service, where the capacity and the infrastructure is the most constrained. And not only is there massive demand for the railroading, as evidenced by the buses and as evidenced by the packed trains between the city and the East End, the traffic crunch on the East End has gotten so bad, school districts are having trouble attracting teachers. Housing prices are obviously obscene because it's the Hamptons, so folks need to be able to commute in, but there's no good way for folks to commute in. You can't build a freeway through there. There's just not the space. So the right-of-way, the LIRR right-of-way, is the best and maybe the only opportunity to really expand transit capacity through this portion of the island, to actually attack what have become sort of pressing public policy concerns. Because if agencies can't staff, they can't deliver services. And if you can't deliver services, you can't keep schools open, right? So that's sort of the Montauk case. The LIRR makes the Yaphank case in the 1994 study, and we'll just quote from that. They offer 3 rationales. One is to expand service from what was then a fast-growing part of Long Island into the city. 2, to relieve the parking strain at Ronkonkoma. Ronkonkoma has some of the biggest parking lots on the planet. Not a joke. This is actually like an advertising point for building them back in the late 80s. And 3, that the park and rides would allay the need to further electrify the Montauk line. It's laid out in the document, but the ridership tables in the back of the report show that the LIRR's own ridership models don't entirely buy the argument that they're making in public. So this is Patchogue versus Yaphank. Under the 1994 plan, Patchogue isn't improved. Patchogue continues to get slow, infrequent diesel service. Yaphank gets massive parking garages to boost its usage and fast electric service. And even despite all the improvements to Yaphank, 2 to 3 times more people are still using the Patchogue station. So we're just going to take each of these rationales. This is trying to get from East Hampton to Yaphank yesterday at noon. Tuesday is not a peak travel day. Noon is not a peak travel time. The best journey Google would come up with is 1 hour and 15 minutes. The worst journey is 1 hour and 40 minutes. And so to just sort of put the park and ride notion to the test real fast, how likely is it someone is going to get in their car, drive for 90 minutes, battle traffic, then park at Yaphank, try to get a train into the city, or are they just going to drive the whole way, right? The utility case, if you're in that situation, is you just keep driving. If you have a car, and I don't. But sort of the idea here is, right, that instead of making people drive to the service, we deliver it directly to the places that are generating the demand. You have to improve a rail line anyways. Let's improve the rail line that's actually closest to where the folks are coming from. And so this is sort of our idea. We had an unconstrained plan, and this is the constrained plan. And there are major benefits that we can deliver. This is sort of sketching out an idea where we're talking about knocking somewhere in the order of 15 plus minutes off the trip between New York City and Patchogue. We electrify the inner portion of the line. It generates 160,000 riders. And if you remember the ridership table, the main line was generating far fewer. These are all organically, locally generated. The model didn't incorporate park and rides. We're looking at locally generated traffic. So if you assume the traffic's equal, you could potentially be putting another 160,000 trips on the roads between the South Shore and Yaphank, which doesn't do anything to alleviate the traffic crisis, whereas this would. So you have an electrification, you have an extension of the second track, and you have what we think is a pretty nifty idea to really do something with the Central Branch, you know, do all the usual modernizations, separate a bunch of grade crossings, a new yard, increase the speed limit to 80 miles an hour would be the biggest speed up of the system since the 1970s Metropolitan Framework. What's limiting the speed on the line is not the geography of the line, it's the diesel equipment, because the station spacings are tight, so the diesels can't get up to speed. And then it delivers benefits for the outer Montauk portion of the line, because an electric service inside basically means you can turn the diesel service outside into the express. So diesel service is deeply penalized by making stops. So we remove all the inner portions of the stops from the local service. This reduces crowding, and it speeds it up by something like 20 minutes. And then the other part we're really sort of intrigued by is this Central Branch idea. So the Central Branch is a right-of-way that sits between Babylon and Bethpage. It does sort of a 45-degree angle like this across Long Island, and it's largely unused. It gets a couple of diesel trains a day. There are no stops. They just pass through sort of one to the other. And there's a lot of people who live along this right-of-way. And this offers an opportunity to take a thing that the LIRR already owns and to put it to like real productive use. One, to create a link, an Eastern Long Island link between the South Shore and the main line, using, again, assets the LIRR already has. Two, serving these really dense pockets of population. This is sort of the northern idea. And this is the northern station, sort of a South Bethpage. This is the Republic Airport, Farmingdale there. And you can see there's just really dense population around the airport that has no easy way to get to a stop. They have to drive to get the train into the city. So there's a new Mid-Island service. There it ties the South Shore directly into the third track, allowing the MTA and the LIRR to deliver the third track benefits to a whole new region of the island. And it allows the MTA to deliver new service to Mid-Island communities that haven't had convenient service before. So this is South Shore, and then this is sort of the Upper Babylon. And so you have the Lindenhurst here, and you have Babylon here, and you have sort of the station here. And again, look at how dense the population is in the immediate vicinity, denser than actually around Babylon. So a lot of the trips coming to Babylon are coming from up here. There's no more space in the Babylon parking lots. This is one way to relieve the pressure on Babylon using existing resources and doing a little bit of infill to really generate new ridership off of existing pieces of the network. So it's been a year of work. You've been pretty patient. This has been an hour of time, which is actually better than any that we managed to get through in the run-throughs for this thing. So I want to thank you for your patience. I want to thank you for coming. We're really excited about what electrification can mean for New York and for the country. And we think it offers an opportunity to really rethink how we get around and to really rethink what New York is and to really rethink sort of the broader scope of the country. We call it the Electric Empire because this is New York and everything has to have empire in the name. But we really think that this is an opportunity to really link together and to bring the state together in a way that it hasn't been before. So that's an hour on the nose. Thank you for your patience and your time, and thank you for listening. Yeah. All right. So there's Q&A. And if John brought the tomatoes, he's free to throw them at me. So yeah, sure. Yeah, hi, in the back with the glasses, because that's
Thanks, Nolan. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Lots to chew on. I wonder if you could expand on that one slide that talked about the leverage points for this merger coming up.
Sure.
How can you advance the momentum framework through that? Like, are there specific rights of way you think those railroads would want to shed? What should agencies be saying in these hearings to advocate for?
Well, I mean, it's not hearings. It's sort of, there's a regulatory approval process, right? So like all the state's attorneys generals can sue or not sue to try to block the merger. sort of in the justice arm of any merger approval. And then the second part is sort of a regulatory approval process that has to be done through what used to be the ICC and is now the STB. And basically, there's sort of two pieces to this, right? One of which is you can make a deal and that requires some money. The other of which is you can try to use the regulatory approval process for the merger to say the public interest in this merger going forward is you have underutilized assets and we want access to those underutilized assets. In terms of like routing what would make sense, there's not a lot in New York State. There's a lot in Pennsylvania. Norfolk Southern's a big deal in Pennsylvania. So the merger right now is Norfolk Southern and BNSF, I think it is, right? UP and Norfolk Southern, sorry. And then I guess sort of the other pairing would be CSX and BNSF whenever that happens. So like the Reading piece, right, would be like one. So if I were like PennDOT, I'd be really interested in trying to secure more access. Ditto sort of Philly to Bethlehem. That's also a lot of Norfolk Southern trackage. There's sort of the Conrail piece of it, which we have to deal with a little bit, which like Jersey Transit has to deal with a lot, which is jointly owned between Norfolk Southern and CSX. And so if I were Jersey Transit, I would be really interested in pressing the case too, because there are improvements they want to make to like the Raritan Valley line, which has a sort of a cut up, if you're familiar with the corridor, into the Northeast Corridor. It's right now, Conrail is insisting on all sorts of improvements get built that really don't need to get built. And it's taken the project and it's just made it enormously expensive. And so it can't go anywhere. That's not in the public interest. So if I were, in JDOT, I would be pushing hard on things like that. Hi.
Just off of that one, how constrained is that approach by the people currently occupying the federal government?
Well, not really. I mean, it is and it's not. There's a lot of authority that the states have over this. States have gone to court on antitrust cases separately. So you don't have to be the Justice Department to bring an antitrust case. You don't have to be the Justice Department to bring a case challenging a merger. So there's sort of the two halves, right? Like we want concessions. Here's the public utility case. We think the merger flies in the face of that. We think it should be blocked under antitrust law. Put it into court. And then the second part of it is the STB case. The STB is in charge of regulating the interactions between passenger rail and freight rail on the intercity network. And so whenever Amtrak wants to run more trains and the freights are saying no, they take the case to the STB. This would be sort of a similar idea. Hey.
One of the nice things about this, I think, is that it fits into the history of American railroad. You would hope it would have less of a sort of cultural pushback from people who currently run the railroad. How do you feel this gets received by people in agencies?
Agents, well, we're trying to, how does it get received by the freight railroads? By the Republicans. By the public. Hopefully it's good. I mean, the whole point of this is to try to say that there's a really productive way to go get more ridership off of your existing routes. That the amount of capital needed is not zero, but it's also not like traditional mega project sized. And it can generate real ridership, helping with a ridership recovery because we're trying to bring people back to cities in any way we can possibly think of. Faster service is a way to do it. And it can help reduce your operating costs, particularly if you're running diesel and you switch to electric. So like if you can get 75, Caltrain's baseline, Caltrain was hurt probably more by the pandemic than any other transit agency in the country. It's Silicon Valley up and down the peninsula. But that they've been able to take people who don't have to take the train and get them back on the train because that's how good the service is, I think should be the bar that we're trying to hit. And electrification is one way to do it. A good way to do it. Yeah.
Did you look in the study at reducing the schedule padding by having a more regular schedule for MTA trains and Amtrak trains rather than sort of random non-repeating situation they have now?
No. I am.
That's additional time saving.
Yes.
On top of
yes. Every schedule that we built our models off of is a schedule that currently exists. There are a lot of ways you can pad a schedule. So when we were going through, we were trying to piece out what the runtime was and then piece out what the dwells were. So like for the Chicago to Detroit, piece out what the runtimes are, piece out the time spent stuck at stations, piece out the time spent accelerating back to speed, and then plugging in the electric value. So it's basically algebra. But the baseline schedule is the baseline schedule. And we were trying to be conservative about it because like if I come in here and say like, I can, build you a bullet train between wherever and whatever, and make it magic. Sure, yes, but like, is that actually practicable? So one of the rules we had about this was we would only use existing rights of way, and everything we were using had to have been previously built or planned somewhere else, so we would have real world comparables. Effectively, to borrow a line that's been used about some of my subway station stories, going to CVS for a transit program, and then 3, that the schedules would be real, like really real. So, if you fix the wires on the Northeast corridor, you can probably get another 10 miles an hour out of the Acela, right? We don't touch the Northeast corridor, but 2, if we were to touch the Northeast corridor, we would not have included that in our calculations. Our calculations are what is the right of way capable of in terms of the geometry. And if we're going slow because of diesel, we assume we can go faster, but we don't bake that into the schedules that we presented. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. Hi.
We're seeing recently SEPTA is like
Yeah.
cutting back on their
Yeah.
service, which is like it's already a very efficient rapid transit system,
Sure.
cost effective and everything, but it still cuts
Right.
funding cut. And
Right.
I mean there's a lot of reason in this
Yeah, the world's ending. Why are we talking about this?
So I'm just wondering like does this framework like address that type of issue, like where it's already efficient but
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. So what we're trying to do here is to give transit agencies a way to deliver really tangible benefits for single billion-dollar projects, to be able to make it easier to make the case to like some of the politicians in Harrisburg that like the spending really matters and it's making constituents' lives better. Most of the opposition to the funding of SEPTA in Harrisburg is coming from places that aren't served by SEPTA. It's one of the benefits of the MTA is sort of the enormity of its geographic region. So politicians on Long Island care about good service, at least for the LIRR, right? Politicians in Westchester and in Dutchess care about good service, at least for the Metro North, right? Politicians in the city care about good service, at least for the subways and the buses. And you get enough people interested in sort of the broader well-being of the MTA that you can round up the votes in Albany generally to get funding, at least in recent years, broadly speaking. SEPTA doesn't have that advantage. So maybe it's a really frustrating thing, right? And there are no good answers for it. Maybe perhaps the way this helps an organization like SEPTA is to be able to not only make the proactive case for investment, but if they ever were, you get an administration that's more willing to fund rail and transit projects, it gives them the ability to get a couple of these things built, and it expands the service area of SEPTA to incorporate more districts, which makes it easier to build the sort of New York-sized political coalition that has kept the MTA relatively fiscally stable during a time when like a lot of other agencies aren't. Like Chicago is running into the same issue between Metro and the CTA, where downstate, outside of Chicago, politicians don't really care, right? And the Chicago delegation isn't big enough to sort of get something through. So the bigger the footprint of your agency, the more essential it is, not just to more people in terms of density, but into more people in terms of geography, because that's how American politics works, helps. It's just, it's sort of, it's just the system we have. All right, this side of the room.
Yes, so now just to expand on that note regarding the shorter intercity service, for example, here in New York, like 3/4 already the county's name that's for the New York State population, Philly barely half of the level, Pennsylvania's population, so of course,
Yeah.
quite a bit more challenging. Now, if we're going to be talking about these services like Philly to Pittsburgh, for example, or New York,
Right.
Buffalo, any of those.
Right.
Given that at the moment, typically you're only having like 1 or 2 trains a day, so
Sure.
have you baked in the assumptions, as in, is there going to be some indicative schedule of one train hour each way, 1 every 2 hours, or any of that?
No, the induction model assumes, so I think sort of maybe the best example of this is service was always frequent on the Northeast Corridor, making the Northeast Corridor faster doubled the ridership. Service was always fairly frequent on the West Coast Main Line. It's the busiest piece of railway in Britain, even in the steam era. They electrify.
California, maybe that would qualify as well, or?
Sure. I mean, you think, yeah. So, but the modeling intercity demand is tough. If you go through the studies that have been done to use the Empire Corridor, for instance, you'll get a litany of potential projected outcomes, all of which are very good, all of which would be beneficial, but there's sort of an order of magnitude difference between them. We're not modeling ridership. We're saying this is the infrastructure that allows us to deliver frequent service. On the induction pieces of it, we're assuming no extra trains get run. This is taking current ridership, speeding the service up, and seeing what the effect on ridership is. We're not assuming that all of a sudden, there's a 10-minute headways at Patchogue. Does that make sense?
Yes, because
It's
what that
been-
would then create is a feedback loop. effect,
Right.
Especially for intercity ones, as in if you get Pittsburgh, Philly, even if it's down 5 hours, it's still able to run the train without each direction.
Sure.
It's that, so would that just for upside be,
I mean, there would be a lot of upside if you could run a train every hour for 5 hours to get between Philly and Pittsburgh. I think everyone would really like that idea. I don't know if it's possible. We didn't study it. So, all right, John.
Hey, thanks, Nolan, for your presentation. Really impressed with three football references and stuff.
I was told that's the thing to do.
So just to, I'm with the NTA, so just to answer a couple of questions that came flying your way about, first, is this worth it? It's absolutely worth it. You had a picture of two folks from 60 years ago, probably, which this summer they kind of took out of bankruptcy the Long Island Railroad, that's Roman Rockefeller.
Yeah.
And we're able to talk about New York and transportation in New York because people like that and state mass transit in New York. Other cities don't have it. There's a lot of abandoned rail lines or lines that are just used by freight. So a lot of work has been put in to get us to where we are today. Secondly, a question even with today is, what's going on in SEPTA. Otherwise, again, you had a lot of effort recently work to stay, keep the transit system afloat, but not only that, but grow it. And we have a lot of ridership. Coming back, so folks who don't know that, it's important to realize ridership's growing in New York. And Governor Hochul's on board. One of the things that you brought up is, particularly on the Hudson line, the governor is pushing that. I think there's a realization that with changing commuting patterns, people want to commute to the city maybe 3 days. And these areas north of Poughkeepsie or in the Poughkeepsie area are more attractive places to live. So there's a lot of great stuff here. I just want to, throw a couple of things out to the group. One is, you talked a lot about third track. Third track was a project that was done with Natalie, was done on time with her budget very quickly, frankly. But the reason was the Long Island Railroad was the only authority in the jurisdiction. It basically could decide when to do the work, how to do the work, make sure people show up. If they didn't show up with their own people, so they have no one to blame, right? So how do you do this when other agencies have jurisdiction over the lines that are needed for these improvement projects?
It's a great question. California has run into this with the high-speed rail line. There's been a lot of really good work done on how Bakersfield, as an example, has managed to use the high-speed rail project to basically extort the authority into building what is effectively a new highway through the city, or to elevate it and expand the street. Anyways, it's effectively a new highway, which is obviously hugely expensive and obviously not a railroad. And yet, in order to get the permits to build the stuff they need for the railroad in Bakersfield, because the California High-Speed Rail Authority has all this bond money sitting there, Bakersfield basically had the opportunity to, how do I put this politely, hold the project hostage, basically. Permitting is a big issue. This predates a lot of people at the MTA, but the city of New York actually played a lot of those games to get a bunch of parks rebuilt as part of the Second Avenue subway project, which again, it's not in terms of like a $6 billion subway project, you know, $100 million to rebuild 10 parks or whatever it was, is not like a sum breaking amount of money, but it's money, right? So there's been a big push from a lot of folks, and I try consciously not to wade into it, to simplify permitting and reviews and to speed things up. Time is money, and to sort of get to a place where agencies like California High-Speed Rail have the authority to sort of at some point self-issue the permits and just go build the thing. Because you can't have an entire state's transportation plan sort of held hostage by, you know, every, you know, county supervisor or whatever, sort of through the stretch of the line, which is sort of functionally the system that we've ended up in. There's been some progress on that. They've exempted electrification from state environmental review in California after communities on the peninsula used the line to file lawsuits to challenge, for instance, trees getting cut down, which is deeply, deeply silly. So it's a huge issue. I think sort of the other piece of it is there's sort of, you have the permits piece of it. And, you know, I know there was some trouble that the MTA had getting the permits out of some of the Long Island villages to do third track. And you guys got stuck rebuilding some tennis courts to make it happen. And parking. So there's just a give and take in the political process. And I don't know exactly how you fix it. You know, there's been give and take in the political process the entire time, sort of the power dynamics sort of shifted to all local and now it's sort of shifting back. But I think sort of the other piece of this is there's a lot of publicly owned right of way in the country that we sort of come across, right? And there's a lot more latitude to make those improvements there. And just making the improvements along the publicly owned pieces of the right of way. So like Chicago to Detroit is basically all publicly owned. So it's just Amtrak, if they decide to do it, if they can find the money to do it, right? Going out there and doing it. And sort of, we hope this report sort of inspires someone to be like, hey, we've got this line, let's go think about it in these terms instead of this duality that rail planning has sort of ended up in, where it's sort of like, well, we have diesel, so we can't go faster than 80. So we're not going to think about going faster than 80. And if we do think about going faster than 80, it's got to be a super high speed line, which has to be 200 miles an hour, which means, you know, cutting a whole new right of way through downtown Detroit and into downtown Chicago, which is plainly never going to happen, right? So it's about, you know, just trying to think about what we currently have, and then how do we like squeeze every drop of juice out of it is sort of the idea.
Thinking about cost efficiencies in terms of stage one, stage two, Second Avenue subway. Yeah. What would you guess there would be a substantial amount of cost savings if you were to say implement the Hudson Corridor plan, doing it all the way from New York to Albany in one go versus just New York City, New York Harvard?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that with experience, it gets cheaper typically. I don't know that experience has to come all from one massive project. We try to divvy it up into packages to reduce risk. You know, the longer a line gets, the more opportunity there is for something to go sideways. So we're trying to think about it in terms of manageable sort of chunks and sizes. I mean, in a lot of ways, maybe it cuts the other way, which is to say you have a project and you learn a bunch of things on a project. Let's go apply all these things we learned to another project. The trick is to keep having projects in the pipeline so you don't lose everyone and you keep learning, right? So we can take the pole spacings from 180 feet, which is what Caltrain did, even though we did 220 feet on the Northeast, right? That's 20% more poles. That's not everything, but if you go and you pull Caltrain's environmental assessments, their starting point is the most expensive catenary project on the planet. And then it got really delayed and then it became even more expensive, right? So it's about learning what do you need, what you don't need. And we're trying to sort of compress the learning curve a little bit by saying this is what everyone else has done. But there's a lot that you learn just from building it. And so being able to go package one, we build it and we assume a cost of high-end conservative cost estimate. We're going to learn a lot of stuff's going to go wrong. That's baked into the price. We're using other sort of first wave electrification projects to incorporate that risk, right? And then you can sort of like, we don't assume it. We assume the costs don't go down. We assume the costs remain conservative and high. But there is an alternative reality in which every time you do one of these things, if you keep doing them, you keep learning things and you keep driving the cost down. So like the French can do it for 10 million a mile because the French National Railway has a fairly consistent rolling pattern, rolling program of just doing these upgrades. And the Brits, to the extent that they can keep a rolling program going, because the country's in poor fiscal condition, have managed to drive their costs down a bunch too. So like there's real evidence that the costs come down with experience. Jerry.
Hold on, have you given any consideration to maybe making this presentation to some people in the federal government on their level? Redirecting money right now.
Well, not to.
For Penn Station, and that money can be spent electrifying.
Yes, it could. A lot of things cosmetic money on Penn Station could be spent on. Yeah, I mean, if they want a presentation, I'm happy to give them the presentation. There is a giant pot of corridor ID money sitting there that's unobligated and unapplied for. I don't know if they would accept an application, but the Hudson Line's already pre-qualified and has been in the corridor ID program since it was created in the 70s. And for the first time in 50 years, there's actually money in the bucket to go do stuff. That money in the bucket has an 80-20 match to it. So you could think about the corridor holistically, right? Or maybe not even holistically, just the southern Albany into the city piece of it, building all of that out, including fixing the power system on the portion that Metro North shares with Amtrak from sort of Riverdale or Spite and Dieval sort of over and then up. Wiring the whole thing from Penn Station all the way to Albany is like a $5 billion enterprise and all in. And if you could get it in the corridor ID with an 80-20 match, it becomes $1 billion in local funds to deliver our 50 trains between New York and Albany and speed up every other stop along the way into the city and speed up probably by, Croton in, if you're on a local, you're probably adding, just fixing the power system probably gets you 10 minutes back right there too, right? So like the benefits stretch the entire line. It's an inner city corridor line, so it qualifies, right, for corridor ID. So there's a lot of money sitting there. I don't know if they're going to accept an application. I don't know if they're interested.
Who makes that happen? Amtrak make that?
Well, this is one of the things we sort of, we've tried to sort of impress upon people is there needs to be a single, I think we actually in the report recommend John do it, which is why he showed up.
I'll second that.
But sort of like someone needs to be in charge, right? Right now, nobody's in charge. Right now, you have the MTA the MTA is a collection of railroads, right? It's sort of the way to think about it. It's sort of like like a Navy carrier group in a lot of ways, right? You've got two subway railroads, and then you have functionally the LIRR, and then which thinks of itself sort of as two railroads in a lot of ways, or actually maybe even three: Diesel, South Shore, and Main Line. And the Main Line is the one they spend the most energy on. And then Metro North is something similar, right? They think of the New Haven line as sort of an independent enterprise from the Hudson and the Harlem lines. Like these are distinctions that date back 100 years. And while some of this has sort of been mashed out of city transit, a lot of it still persists in the railroad side of things. But having just a single agency in charge, and that single agency in charge willing to sort of sit down with everyone and say, no, guys, the goal is 2 hours to Albany. How do we make it happen using the existing right-of-way? Electrification can do it. Why aren't we doing electrification? Like just really sort of like putting the question out there, right? Like starting the conversation. Working for the Post, you learn pretty quickly that you can't have a door slammed in your face and a no comment in a story unless you go knock on the door, right? You got to knock and you got to make the ask. So that's the starting point here. But if we were to pursue it, there would need to be a single entity probably in charge of just crafting like what should the corridor look like, right? What and what are we aiming to achieve? And right now, there's not even a unified set of goals for that, really. There's sort of NYSDOT has its thing, Amtrak has its thing via NYSDOT, the MTA has its thing for the electric piece, and then a separate thing for the diesel piece. And then you have CSX sort of doing everything on the western portion. So the starting ground is sort of an organization, a unified plan, and then sort of knowing the conversation we want to have and sort of having that framework, and then going into having the conversation with everyone saying like, this is sort of what we do.
That FRA is actually developing a scope like that right now.
Oh, very cool. As part of corridor ID?
It's tangentially related, that probably started on Penn Station capacity and then developing outwards from that.
Oh, well,
So it's
okay.
like the first part of Penn Station capacity, the second part is the whole system,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's premised on things you're saying.
Yeah, that's good to hear. If mildly discouraging that it's tied into Penn Station, which will, I mean, it's like, it's World War I, really. We're fighting over the same 10 miles of trench and everyone's dying.
New York State will do without him. What can they do?
Well,
Their own destiny?
Amtrak's just the operator. So NYSDOT holds the lease for everything between Poughkeepsie and Schenectady. You would have to negotiate modifications to the lease with CSX. You could either straight up buy it from CSX. They only run a couple of freight trains a day. Michigan bought the line from CSX for Detroit, which was similarly underutilized. The MTA also has a lot of leverage here in that a lot of those freight trains need to run into the city anyways. And so the MTA actually controls the dispatching and sort of the infrastructure framework that either those trains fit or they don't fit. So there's like, we're not sitting down at the table at CSX sort of entirely sort of, hand out to a freight railroad that isn't interested in doing anything. So we like, there are opportunities. There are options. We control, south of Poughkeepsie, we entirely control our fate. North of Poughkeepsie, we'd have to eke out, the particular concession, is CSX requires clearances at 22 plus feet. The wires for the Northeast corridor are typically hung at 21 feet. CSX isn't running anything taller than 17 feet. So there's really no reason for the 22 feet rule. And we just, buy back a foot of clearance space, sort of like an air rights deal in the city, so that would be enough to get us to Albany, which would be huge. All right. One more.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thanks.
So you mentioned Caltrain a few times. One of the things that's happened in Caltrain is a couple of minutes have been added back to the schedule since electrification.
Yes.
I think this has happened in a lot of transit systems where you design a system to a speed, operators operate it, run into issues.
Yeah.
Slow orders or schedule padding. So I guess how do you deal with that problem of like potential creep where you then reduce travel times over time, even if you've
So there's an order of magnitude improvement from the electrification alone, which I think is important to point out. So like the local between San Jose and San Francisco used to take like 90 minutes. And even with the schedule creep at Caltrain, it's still around an hour, right? So it is massively faster. The benefits remain, and whether it's a 57-minute trip or I think it's 60 minutes for the local, maybe it's 60 minutes for the bullet and 75 minutes for the local. Eric, do you remember? All right, I don't have the timetable in front of me, but it is substantial. It is like a 25% plus differential in speed, even with the schedule creep back in. Most of the schedule creep is coming from the fact that they're having trouble controlling their dwells because Caltrain still has low platforms. They didn't put the high platforms in, and we already have the high platforms. So our dwells are easier to control because we're not having people negotiating stairs. So that's solved for just by fixing the stations alongside. Hey.
Thanks for everything. So one quick question, I guess I'm wondering about our starting point with Port Jefferson.
Yeah.
So like I know that's like moving along. For the cat area, is that something that came up in planning? Did it not come up? Was it dismissed out of hand?
It's not in the initial engineering feasibility study.
Okay.
So yeah, like the MTA will hire engineering firms to do the work. How do we make it work? But the front end of that process is we want X. We want to spec at X, right? Which is sort of like the ground zero. And so it's not considered because no one asked them to consider it. That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. Hey.
Hey, to what extent do you think these projects are, depending on federal support or cooperation, where are the boundaries?
Everything inside of a single state doesn't technically need federal approval unless you want federal money. There is, I don't think it's any secret, sort of what's going on right now. I think sort of what we're trying to do is sort of twofold, one of which is say that at least in New York, where there's a lot of support for transit, this is not a budget buster for us. We're trying to sort of make that like, we're trying to get electrification into the resource envelope that we've already allocated to the MTA. Outside of New York, transit agencies and DOTs are a little less lucky, but it's conceivable that like you get enough people and, you know, for instance, in Michigan interested to like have a 3-hour train to Chicago. I mean, I think, you know, the value is enormous. And you do like a state transit bond, right? Like that's also not, we do bonds for freeways all the time. So why not for this? And you sort of go that way. Like there are ways for states to finance this stuff independent of the federal government. So sort of the other piece of this is the planning process, just doing environmental clearance, whether you're using state law or the federal law, is a minimum 2 years, right? You're gonna do a lot of the preliminary engineering in there. You get the sign off and then you go compete for the federal money. So you can't really compete for the grants until the EIS is done. So just the timeline on doing the EIS means that by the time you're ready to go compete for the money, there will be not a partisan thing.
A lot of wood.
There will be, yeah. I guess we do that. There will be an administration more favorable to investing in rail. George Herbert Walker Bush, father, was the guy who insisted on Congress funding the North End electrification because he grew up in Connecticut, right? Like this idea that passenger service and fast trains and caring about, you know, administration of like infrastructure as like a partisan thing is a fairly recent and hopefully, if we ever want to get anything permanently built in this country, temporary sort of artifact of our political moment, you know? Yeah.
For the Upper Hudson case study, that include like, for instance, they're doing the Upper Hudson re-signaling, right, as part of the current plan.
Yeah.
Any of the electrification studies include any, like, does the cost, I guess, include?
Yeah, it's 60 million a mile, you're buying signals. Yeah, that's the whole kit and caboodle. So like when they redid the single branch from Ronkonkoma, which went from single branch from either Bethpage or Farmingdale out to Ronkonkoma, you had to put in a second track, you had to put in a second set of third rail. Well, we put the third rail costs out. You had to put in a separate set of signals, you had to rebuild the stations, had to like, all that is in that $55 million figure. And that's also basically what Chicago spent, or not Chicago, this North Indiana there's what they call the South Shore Line, which is the commuter line that runs from South Bend in Indiana into Chicago. It's electrified, and they had to do a huge amount of structural work to double track it through a key piece of the system, because it was not only single tracked, they still had street running like it was 1910, right? Where you have literally like freight trains coming down, you know, like the middle of these towns, and like everything in downtown, everyone would have to park their cars. And if anyone was like backing out of a parking spot at that point in time, you would shut down the entire line, right? Until this person was done backing up. And if there was a, a fender bender or whatever, like your line was just screwed. So it required a tremendous amount of structural work, including entirely reshaping the right of way and sort of cutting the right of way through these towns, properly grade separating it. And that was 55 million a mile. So like you can buy a lot of modernization for 55 million a mile.
It just also for the, did you look at the, is there like a resiliency angle, I guess? Like,
yeah, it's mentioned in there. The resiliency angle, I think, is really clear in a couple of ways. One of which is third rail means you have to put a substation in every mile. If you're having to put a substation in every mile, it's you're putting it in places that, particularly on low-lying routes, are pretty easily flooded. The Hudson Line's the obvious example. And with overhead wiring, not only are you getting all of your power transmission equipment to the trains 20 feet above the tracks, so, barring a tsunami, it's not going to flood. It's also much more efficient in terms of the number of assets that you need, right? So like you need a substation every 30 miles, and then you need, sort of the major pieces of equipment go from being needed every mile, give or take, to like every 7 or 8 miles. And then substations, which are the most expensive part of it, you only need every 30 or 40 miles. And so those sorts of spacings mean you can sort of pick the high points along the route and use the geography to your advantage, which bolsters the resiliency case. All right. Last question to Evan. Hi.
So, I mean, file is under a nice problem to have, I suppose.
Yes.
If you start
moving towards, you know, electrifying a whole bunch of existing right of ways. Have you given any thought to, and this could cut both ways, you can see this as an argument for, you know, a jobs program or an argument for needing.
We love jobs programs. Yeah,
I mean, there's not a whole lot of rolling stock capacity that we have, right?
it's a very nice problem to have.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah, if we can do it and we need to go buy some trains, there's a little bit of lag time. Yeah. But we fix that by buying trains, right? So to have the eggs, we need the chickens.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys.